Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, YRB Laws, and this is my co-host.
Christopher Wells.
We appreciate all the support on our recent series. This has been a long one, but we are nearing the end of the Western portion of this series, and we've seen you guys pretty much going back and enjoying the previous videos. So we love to see that, and we hope you guys continue to support us and the channel also by liking and subscribing and following us on Instagram and X at the OBT Podcast for updates.
Yeah, so, again, we continue to appreciate that. So we're going to get into our second to last team of the Western Conference, and that's the reigning NBA champions, the Denver Nuggets.
Yes, sir.
So, yeah, so this team, it was kind of funny because going back to the bubble, right? They had been a, relatively perennial playoff team, right?
Sure.
For a couple years going into the bubble.
Mm-hmm.
But the bubble was kind of where it felt like, Denver was starting to really be on the rise, right?
Yeah.
Even though they lost to the Lakers in 5, they did have those two, crazy 3-1 comebacks in the first round against the Jazz and then in the second round against the Clippers. Um and so it felt like, wow, this is a team, that's on the rise. You got some young, really good talent on the come up. And then, the following season, right, Jamal Murray tears his ACL,
Yeah.
relatively midway-ish through the season, right? So he's out, for the rest of that season and the following season. Just awful, just horrific. And then Michael Porter Jr., right, who was a guy that they drafted and invested a lot into, right? Then he had some back issues
Mm-hmm.
2 seasons ago as well, right? So he misses most of the season. And Jokic, is kind of by himself, right? And then he's kind of building that individual legacy, right? He wins the back-to-back MVPs,
Yep.
goes out, in that first MVP year, right? I believe, he won in the first round against the Blazers, and that was an upset because I think they were, even though they were the 3 seed, they were not favored because again they were missing Jamal Murray.
Right.
But they were Lillard's Blazers. Then they lost to the Suns. No shame in that, right? Lost to healthy Suns. Following year, right? That was last season or 2 seasons ago, excuse me. Lost to the Warriors in the first round. No Jamal Murray, right? A lot of guys, that are okay players if they're coming off the bench, right? But not guys that should probably be starting, right? I like Austin Rivers, but he was the starting guard
Right.
2 seasons
It's
ago
just
for
not
Denver.
ideal for a championship.
Right. And then last season, right? Then Jamal Murray's back, Michael Porter Jr.'s back. They're both healthy. They're, early on lose a few games, and it's kind of weird, but after that, they were kind of cruising, right? For a while, they were, head and shoulders above everyone in the Western Conference. I think they had as much of as like a 8-game lead or so,
Yeah.
or something like that, right? And then the last 2 months of the season, right, they took off basically, right? Because for much of the year, the battle was who's the MVP, Jokic or Embiid, right? And for a while, it looked like it was leaning Jokic, and then like I said, with the Nuggets, then like I said, they took those last 2 months off, and then it kind of felt like people were starting to not feel as confident about Denver. Um, Even though they weren't looked at as a favorite to come out of the West, right? They were playing really well.
Sure.
And then once they had just the stretch where, they didn't look as good, they weren't as consistent, they were playing poorly on the road. You just weren't sure about them, right? And then they put all those answers to rest with a, terrific playoff run, right? Only I think they went 16-4,
Mm-hmm.
right? They beat the Timberwolves in 5, beat the Suns in 6, swept the Lakers, and then beat the Heat in the
They were
finals in 5.
cruising.
Yeah, exactly. So obviously led by Jamal Murray and Nikola Jokic,
Yep.
right? They're two-headed monster, right? Jokic obviously is their best player, superstar, but Jamal
Absolutely.
Murray was no slouch, right? He had a great postseason, again, and they don't win that title without his,
Oh
abilities.
no. They don't even
Um,
get there without him.
yeah, yeah, and again,
Clearly,
he's
as you just said, all those years without him, look what
right,
happened.
yeah, and that's kind of been the crazy thing is that, both of those guys, have elevated their games in the playoffs. I mean, Jamal Murray, especially, I mean, when you look at his regular season, he was, been in like the low 20s or high teens, right?
Right.
Last season, he averaged 21 and 5 a game. Then in the playoffs, he averaged 26
Yeah.
a game, 7
That's a big
assists,
jump.
6. Yeah, that's a huge jump and still incredibly efficient. 47 from the field, 39 and a half from 3.
Yes.
Made it just huge shots down the stretch, right? And then obviously Jokic, right? Averaged 24 and a half, 10 and then 12 last season, right?
Mm-hmm.
Shot 63% from the field, 38 from 3 in the playoffs. Didn't shoot 63% from the field, but still shot 55, which is
Yeah.
really good, and
Very
shot
good.
46 and shot 46% from 3.
Even
And
better.
averaged 39 and a half and 13 and a half a game, 1 steal, 1 block. So, I think the knock on the team going into, that title run was, we know they can score. We know they have talent, but can
Mm-hmm.
they get stops, when they need to? Can they
Right.
defend? And they were able to do that, right? Aaron Gordon was huge for them defensively. Contavious Caldwell Pope was huge for them
Yeah.
defensively. Even guys like Christian Brown, even like a Jeff Green, right? They would come in and kind of, muck things up on defense.
Bruce
And even
Brown.
at times his defense, while not elite, obviously by any means, his defense in the playoffs was, I think, better than you would have expected, right? He's really good at reading passing lanes,
Yeah.
intercepting steals. He's not a rim protector, but because he's so big, it's not
He's
just like,
smart.
yeah, exactly. He's a smart defender. Doesn't really make like a lot of silly decisions on defense in terms of fouls, right? So he's never very rarely going to get in foul trouble.
Right.
Um, so he can do some things, again, not like not the same defensively as, some other centers, but he showed in the playoffs he was certainly fine defensively for the most part. Now,
Yeah.
again, maybe you factor in, all right, what if he's going against a pick and roll guard? Again, I challenge, you to find like, 5+ centers that, can consistently stay in front of guards in the pick and roll. There's not very many.
Yeah.
And
It's
the
a
ones,
hard
and
ask.
even the ones yeah, and even the ones that can, they don't have, the offensive abilities that Jokic has, right? Like, like even like Anthony Davis is great defensively. He's not as good on offense as Jokic is.
Sure.
Just in terms of like all the different things that Jokic can do,
Even Embiid too.
with the ball. Yeah, even Embiid, right? So so that's kind of where you have to look at it. So going into this offseason, right, we knew that there wasn't a whole lot they could do flexibility wise because it's a very expensive roster, right? You may not think of it like that, right? But Jokic is making almost 50 million. Jamal Murray and Michael Porter Jr. both make over 30 million a year. Aaron Gordon at over 20. Caldwell Pope at over 14 and a half. And then after that, some mid-level salaries, but still, right? Like that's a pretty expensive roster, so not a whole lot of room for flexibility there.
Yeah.
We knew they were going to lose some guys, right? Bruce Brown, who I hadn't mentioned yet, right? He was a big part of their playoff run last year. It's kind of like a big physical guard that was, that could do a lot of different things, right? Rebounding, defense, toughness. Um, right. We knew they were going to lose him because they just couldn't afford to, keep him, right? He got
Yeah.
20 million a year from Indiana. I think
You
2
can't
years
pay
with the
that.
second year option. Yeah, and I think the most they could give him was like might have been like 5 or 7ish or something.
Mm-mm.
Like it wasn't a lot. It was
Yeah.
like it was yeah, it was at a level where like he would have been insane to turn that down to stay
Yeah.
in Denver. So
Yeah. He would have been
um
selling himself short. Even
right.
if they were trying to run it back, still, I wouldn't
Yeah,
do that either.
exactly. They brought back Reggie Jackson, they brought back DeAndre Jordan, right? Those were not guys that were really rotational guys for them. Reggie Jackson they got in the buyout market. He didn't really do much. DeAndre Jordan, they signed him, but he was more like a locker room
Oh,
guy, right?
for
He wasn't
sure.
really expected to be like a yeah, exactly. He wasn't expected to be a contributor. So really the main thing that they did in the offseason was more so in the draft. They had, I believe 3 draft picks, right? They took Jalen Pickett, who's a point guard, right? We saw him in the summer league, right?
Hmm.
I believe he's out of Penn State.
Yeah.
Um, kind of a like sort of like an old school ish guard, right? Where he sort of like plays with his back to the basket, at times, right? He can kind of play in the pick and roll. He's a little bit older, right? He's 23. I think he'll be 24 when the
Hmm.
season starts. Um, but I think he can provide some value, just again as a guy that can do some different things. Hunter Tyson, that was a forward they took out, I believe, out of Clemson, right? He's kind of more just like a stretch,
Yeah.
3-point shooter, right? Again, he's another 23-year-old, late second, mid second round pick. Um, and then after that, I believe Julian Strother, right? They
Hmm.
took him as well.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly. So, another forward, out of Gonzaga, right? A little bit younger, 21, will be 22, I think, to
He's
start the
got a
season.
jump shot though.
Um, yeah, exactly. Really good shooter. So that's kind of the interesting aspect is they took guys that, are not really necessarily looked at as projects. I think they took guys that are a little bit more like they can probably step in and contribute a little bit.
Yeah.
Um, and again, when you're kind of limited in terms of what you can do, if you're Denver, that's kind of what you have to do. Because again, they're not a free agency destination. They're never going to be. So they kind of have to find ways to, make up for that by drafting really well, which they've done, right? They drafted most of their core guys, right?
Yeah.
Jamal Murray, Jokic, Michael Porter Jr., right? All those guys they drafted. And none of them were like, Jamal Murray, I guess, was, a lottery pick, right? But he wasn't looked at in the same way that he is now.
Yeah.
Michael
He
Porter
took his
Jr.
game to a different level.
Yeah, Michael Porter Jr. was great in high school. Then he had the injury in college, so
Back
then
injury.
that
Yep.
lowered his stock, right? So he ended up falling, towards the bottom of the lottery. So that was a gamble. And
Great
he's been,
steal though.
pretty solid. Yeah, exactly. He's been pretty solid. It seems like his role is different than what you would have thought it was going to be because he's more so like a spot up
Which is
shooter cutter
crazy.
guy. So, yeah, he doesn't really have like a high usage type role. which I guess in some ways can be good because it just limits the amount of stuff you have to do with him. But then it also just means that, like, well, we saw in the playoffs at times when his shot wasn't falling. What else does he do?
Yeah, because
Right.
he's not a defender, not a playmaker. So
Right. Exactly. So, and that's kind of something that we saw in terms of the Bruce Brown factor, right? Let's say if Michael Porter Jr. wasn't playing well, they just stick Bruce Brown in there, right? So they had options. Um, like I said, I liked kind of what they did with the draft. Again, I don't know how much those guys will play, but Christian Brown, he was a rookie last year and he was a guy, that played a decent amount. And then in the playoffs, right, he ended up, having some pretty solid games for them during
yeah,
the playoffs. And I mean, there were a couple of games where he was kind of like a key factor.
yeah.
Um,
The one game I think he only missed like what, one shot or something like that.
Yeah, I think I can't, it was either game 2 or 3. No,
Yeah,
it wasn't game 2. I think it was either game 3 or 4 of the finals, right, where he had that huge stretch in the second half,
yeah.
where it was like kind of a competitive game and then Denver ended up running away with it.
Mm-hmm.
He had a couple of stretches I think in like against Phoenix and Minnesota where he played well. So, I guess that's kind of what you're hoping for if you're Denver is that, you got 3 guys, so hopefully one of them, can contribute,
Right.
and to kind of like make up for the Bruce Brown minutes. Um so that's kind of one thing that I guess I'm kind of worried about is I do think that's a loss. I don't think it'll affect them in the regular season though, because I think in the regular season, as long as Jokic is healthy, even if like Jamal Murray misses regular season time, I think they're more than capable of winning a lot of games because
Easily.
their core guys are just really solid and they've got the continuity advantage that other teams don't have because they've been playing together for years.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and again, like Jokic, you can just drop him in a game and he can basically give you like 30, 15, and 10
Yeah,
in a regular.
there's no real answer for him yet, which is
Right.
interesting.
So yeah, and again, especially in the regular season, or I guess now obviously we can mention playoffs for that matter, but in
Sure.
the regular season, you don't need a whole lot around Jokic to win games.
No, he
So,
makes a lot of people better around him.
right. So I think the playoffs is more where it's going to be a factor. I think for now, I think because they did win the title, I think you do still have to give them the benefit of the doubt that for now they're the best team in the Western Conference.
I agree.
Based off of what they were able to do last year, I think that the gap between them and the next tier, because I do think like they were kind of in like their own tier, and
I
then
agree.
below them is the next tier, of whichever teams, the other teams we've talked about. I do think though that the gap is a little bit like, narrower now, I guess, because they didn't really do a whole lot in the offseason.
Sure.
But they still should be a team that should be like one of the top 2 seeds,
Yeah.
assuming Jokic is healthy.
Mm-hmm.
And they should at least be able to get to, the conference finals or something like that.
Yeah.
Obviously, I think now we're kind of in an era where it's very clear that like the matchups are a lot more important now. Not
Sure.
that took away from what Denver did, but just more so from the perspective of all these teams are a little bit closer now. Because when you think about it a decade ago, um, like we only really had like 2 or 3 teams at a time where we were like, yeah, this team could probably win the title, right? Like you go back 2013, right? What was that? Like Heat, Spurs, and then below them, I guess you could say Indiana, maybe
Sure.
OKC, right? But that again, like that's not very many teams, right? Now we're talking about like 2, 3 teams in each conference
And it's
who could,
gradually gone up over time because like
right?
even like 2016, like you had Warriors obviously in the West, Rockets, so I don't know.
Yeah,
It's interesting.
yeah, exactly. So I mean, that's kind of where we're at now. Where like just I think that there's in terms of the teams and like think about it this way, right? We've had 5 different champions the last 5 seasons, right? Basically, right? We had
Yeah.
the Raptors in 2019, we had the
Mm-hmm.
Lakers in 2020, the Bucks in 2021, right? Warriors in 2022, and then last season was the Nuggets. You could make the case potentially that maybe the Nuggets of those 5 teams like might be the best equipped to go back to back just because they have, like a young core, you got a superstar in their prime. So you don't really necessarily like factor injuries, but they did have injuries a couple seasons before they won the title. So I don't know, like either way, they're still going to be great. They're still going to be one of the best teams in the league. They're still going to be in the mix for the title. I don't know if I would feel at like I don't know if I would say that they're going to win the title this year just because I do think teams have gotten better, but I think for now they still have earned the benefit of the doubt of being the best team in the West and I
They
still
should be the
expect them.
favorite.
Yeah, I think they should be the favorites for the most part, right? You know
Yeah.
what I mean? Like cuz we'll
Yes.
see what happens cuz we had a couple of quirky things happen last season, with the way that the Bucks kind of just fell out, but either way, I think so far they've earned the benefit of the doubt because they won the title last year, and there's no real reason to think that they're going to take like a huge step back at all.
I think at
That
this
they should
point
be.
we can say that this team is probably one of the only ones in the West that has actually lived up to the potential and proven themselves, out of all
Yeah.
the teams that are up there.
Right, because you think about it, right, in the Western Conference, right, you have, three cores, I guess, in a way that won a title, right? Because you obviously have Denver's core that won a title. You have the Lakers core, at least
Yeah.
LeBron and AD, they won a title. Even though the rest of the guys, bless you, even though the
Thanks.
rest of the
All right.
guys weren't necessarily there.
Right.
The Warriors core, right, they won a title. But then after that, right, then it's like, the Suns, right, who, obviously you can have up there, but, their core hasn't won a title.
No.
Basically just Durant. And then after that, right, the Clippers, right, like Kawhi's won a title, but the Clippers core is
Right.
not. And then after that, like no one else has. So it's kind of like what you said. There's only a few teams that have kind of lived up to, their championship, caliber status, right? The
Right.
Lakers were able to do it. The Nuggets were able to. The Warriors were able to do it. But like I said, I do think of the last five teams, they could be the most well equipped to go back to back. I
I
don't
agree.
necessarily know if they're going to do it just because we've had a different champion the last several seasons. But, again, like Jokic, he's a guy that doesn't necessarily miss a lot of time, and they're going to win a lot of regular season games. And if they have home court advantage, it's very clear they're very tough to stop at home.
Yeah.
And they showed they could win on the road. And like now, there's no pressure for them, because they've already won a title. So like there's pressure on other teams that haven't won a title yet. Say like the Suns
Yeah.
or the Clippers or somebody like that. But there's no pressure for Denver because even if people put them in as the favorites, like they've already won a title, so they already know what it means to
And
get
if
there.
if they
Right? They've
lose,
already
it's no big deal either.
like they've already climbed the mountaintop, so to speak, so they know what it takes to get there, and they've done it before. Even let's say like Michael Malone, right? Like he was the coach, and some people weren't quite sure, what he could do, necessarily, but he showed, he did a pretty solid job with the Nuggets last year, right? Because he did do things during the postseason, that did make a difference at times, right? Like we saw, again, he was able to trust, say like Christian Brown, a rookie, right? He put a rookie
Yeah.
into a spot of, hey, go out there and play some defense, muck some things up, play your role. And again, he trusted him.
Yeah.
Again, we also saw some adjustments he made at different times, right? Like I know in the finals down the stretch, right? He started doing this thing where he would start the fourth quarter with Jokic and Murray as opposed to like having, the starters kind of like, come off the bench,
Right.
not on the court to start the fourth. And that, kind of threw Miami for a loop. So, I think that they're pretty well equipped to go back to back. Like I said, I don't necessarily know if they're going to do it, but I do think that so far this team I think should be considered the favorites. But it is kind of funny because again, they won the title last season, but they were definitely not one of the favorites
No.
going in.
They were under the
Um,
radar as the
yeah,
number
but
one seed, which is crazy.
right, yeah, exactly. But now that they have won the title, right now there's going to be more, consistent expectations and beliefs in them. But again, they showed they could live up to the task, right? Because that's the thing, like say for but for me, like what separates them from say like a team like Phoenix, right? Where Phoenix should be great offensively as well. Is I know Denver at the end of the game is more than capable of getting stops, and like because we saw them do it in the playoffs. Not that Phoenix has no chance, right? But we saw Denver actually do it. So I know what I'm going to get out of Denver. For the most part, just about more than any other team. Because
Sure.
again, like even some of the other teams that we talked about where we think they can go far, we don't know as much of what we're going to get out of them, right? Like we don't know what we're going to get out of, Chris Paul fitting in on the Warriors, right? We assume that the Suns are going to be good, but we still got to see them in action. But
Right.
we saw this Nuggets team; it's basically the same team. Just a few role players have been switched out.
And there's no answer for them, like
Right.
as we
Yeah.
saw
So
last season. So unless anything's changed, I don't know. I think they're probably going to go back to back. It wouldn't surprise me.
yeah. Um, Yeah, so I guess that's kind of the thing. And, we looked at, the over unders again. Like I said, we don't encourage or, tell people to gamble, but, they've been projected at like 53.5, like basically number one in the West again, which again makes sense. As long as Jokic is healthy, they're going to win a ton of regular season
Yes.
games. It's just a matter of, well, will they be healthy come playoff time? Because they weren't the two seasons before, but they were last year. And,
Right.
again, that's pretty much the case for just about any team. So, in terms of their offseason, I don't feel like there was much that they had to do. Obviously losing Bruce Brown, excuse me, I was kind of disappointed, that they didn't really pick up anybody of real significance. I liked what they did in the draft, though, just because, again, you expect if you draft three guys, one of them can probably at least play a little bit.
Hmm.
Uh, so, I guess, we can kind of get into it now. Like, what did you think of their offseason? What grade would you give them? I know we kind of like went a little bit faster through this team than some of the other ones, but
Right.
there really isn't quite as much to get into in terms of the offseason stuff, just because it was mostly draft oriented.
Yeah. Well, like you said, they didn't really do much in the free agency except for pretty much re-sign Reggie Jackson, but they did lose out on Bruce Brown. So I do have to take that into account. So I'm going to give them pretty much a C, I think, just because I think they did a great job in the draft. I really like their young guys, whether it be Julian Strother, um, Jalen Pickett. There's just a lot of good guys that they picked up. And then also, there's a second year player, too, that I think, we didn't talk about or mention. Peyton Watson. We saw him play in the Summer League. He
Yeah,
was really
guard.
phenomenal.
Yeah.
So they do have like some young weapons, which I think is really cool to see. Because adding youth onto a younger core, anyways, is kind of an interesting strategy. So I'm curious to see how that works out. But yeah, I think I'm gonna give them a C just because they lost Bruce Brown, but they did do a great job in the draft. So kind of averages out.
Yeah, I think I'm kind of with you where I give them like a C, C plus, just because again, like you said, it averages out, right? Because they didn't do a whole lot in free agency, but they did have a solid draft. So and
Exactly.
the draft is kind of like what prevents it from getting a lower grade. Because again, like you said, we have to look at both. Because before when we talked about free agency, right, our thoughts on teams' free agency might be different than what we thought about the draft. And what we thought about vice versa, and then how that feeds into our offseason thoughts. So yeah, I pretty much say that. But and again, it's like they didn't have to really do a whole lot as
No,
some other teams because they already won the title. And you don't really need to shake things up as a championship
they're
team.
still the best.
Pretty much yeah, pretty much what you're doing is you just gotta, either replace, or add on to what you already have. Because we knew they were gonna lose Bruce Brown. Even Jeff Green is kind of a, that's a factor because he was a guy that at times, provided for them, and he is a veteran guy. But again, ideally the hope is that like I said, one of these new guys, can come in, or maybe Christian Brown, rather than going from like a, every once in a while type of guy, maybe he can become like a every night guy, right?
Right.
Because he's a second year player, like you mentioned, similar to Peyton Watson. So, what if those guys pop, then that also might, not put quite as much pressure on the rookies that they drafted. And then maybe they only have to be a certain level. I guess of
Exactly.
the three guys they drafted, like, which one do you think is most likely to make the biggest difference in the regular season, for them, or
Um,
potentially play whichever one.
I'm probably gonna have to either. I'm gonna have to go with probably Julian Strother. I really like his game. He's very young. He definitely has a shot, and I think that's something that they can potentially sub in for. Say Michael Porter Jr. has a stinker or something like that. Then I think he'll be a reliable option. But I think they did very well in the draft because they drafted pretty much NBA ready role playing guys, which I think is something that we do see very frequently happen when a team does, win a championship or even say they're just a good team. They normally don't, go for like game changing guys or super projects. They just get
Right.
guys who are going to help them get over that hump. So I would definitely go with Julian Strother. I think his skill set is there for sure. And, small forwards that can shoot or just forwards in general that can shoot are very valuable. But, my only concern with him would probably be the defense. But, I think his shot will outshine that.
Yeah, I think that's probably the right guess. Because the thing you say with like a Pickett is you have Jamal Murray, so it's like how much is he going to play? But
Right.
then you could also factor in, well, Jamal Murray, has missed a lot of time, so if he ends up missing like a stretch of like 10, 12 games or something, maybe maybe like Reggie Jackson like slots in as the starter, and then like maybe
Right.
Pickett's the backup
Yeah,
or something like that.
that's a good thought process too.
Yeah. Um, yeah, but yeah, like you said, forwards, obviously who are versatile, right? Are some that's one of the most valuable types of players you can have on a roster.
Yes,
So if you and those are the type of players that are really difficult to find because everybody wants them. So if you can potentially find those in the draft, that's kind of like you
it's a
said, a
steal.
steal in a way.
Hmm.
Um, because again, like you can never have too many of those. I mean, obviously you need to have like a good mix, but it's just because a team like Denver doesn't have 20 million in cap to spend, they can't just be like, let's go out and sign like a top whatever 3-and-D forward, right? They
Right.
can't do that. They have to be a little bit more creative, either through the draft or maybe even through like trades or something.
Sure.
Um, but it's like, at the same time, like they don't really have a ton of quote unquote tradable contracts other than, like the younger guys on the roster, right? Because I don't think they're going to trade any of their core guys right now because they all helped them win a title.
Right.
So it's like, after that, right? Like you got Murray, Porter, um, Caldwell Pope, Gordon, and Jokic, right? I don't think any of those guys are going to be moved. So after that, right, then it's like Reggie Jackson at 5 million, and then everyone else is lower than that, right? So it's like, this is probably for the most part going to be the team, for the whole season,
Oh
save
yeah.
for maybe a couple of guys getting moved or something, for either picks or whatever. Kind of like what happened, last season, right? Where like, they traded for Thomas Bryant, where I think it was like they traded, what was his name? He was a guard. I can't remember his name, but he was like a two-way guard kind of, and they traded him to the Lakers. And then the Lakers
Okay.
ended up cutting him,
Okay.
but
Got you.
it was just one of those guys. And like that was one of the only. Oh, Devon Reed, that was his
Okay.
name. Yeah,
Goodness, I
exactly.
forgot
So
about him.
yeah, exactly. So that's what I'm saying. Like, those type of moves, those are probably the ones that Denver's most likely to make, where they're just kind of like swapping some of those smaller guys. Because I just, I don't think they're going to trade any of their core guys, and that's most of their salary.
Right.
But I don't think they have to do a whole lot. Because, like we
Mm,
said, they showed last year that they're, one of the best teams in the league.
yeah.
Um, and again, in the Western Conference so far, they're the ones that I think everybody's got to look to knock off. You know what I mean?
Yeah. They're the head honchos. They're at the top of the food chain, and that's what happened. So
Yeah, exactly. And again, it makes sense because again, they got a young core that's really good, and their best player is, entering his prime. And the rest of that core, because again, like they're all either, entering their primes as well, or like, not quite there yet, right? Like, Michael Porter Jr. is still pretty young, you know, and again, everyone else is as well. But say like Jamal Murray, he's 26, right? So he
right.
hasn't technically hit his prime yet.
Right.
And now that he's coming off a title, what does he look like? Because he's
Right.
never been an all-star.
Which is
But
crazy.
yeah, but like, what if all of a sudden he's, kind of goes off and starts, having like, all-star caliber type seasons from this point on?
Hmm.
It's just kind of interesting, to see the trajectory of these teams. But it is kind of wild, right? Because they were in the conference finals in the bubble, and then we just kind of forgot about them in a way where, like, because they weren't 100%. And it just felt like, that it was kind of a disappointment because it was like, wow, they went from the Western Conference Finals. We thought they were going to be somewhere around that every year to, going out early. And then, now they come back and win a title. So,
Yeah.
it's a wild thing, in the NBA. But, we'll
It's been
see
a
if they can.
pleasure to watch their journey. Really.
Yeah. Yeah. So we'll see if they go back to back. But, like I said, I think of the last several teams, they're the most poised, I think, to just,
Yeah.
again, given the situation, right? The Warriors, they won the title 2 seasons ago, but because of their age, of the core, you just knew that like it was probably going to be difficult for them to win to
Right.
go back to back, and they didn't.
Right.
The Bucks, you would have thought they would have been poised, but guess what? They had injuries as well, and then they
Injuries.
had
Yeah.
injuries again, and their other two guys other than Giannis are older-ish, right? Because Middleton's already 30, and Drew Holiday's in his 30s. So,
Yes.
and then before that, right, the Lakers, right? You have to factor in LeBron with his age, and then now AD's 30. And they tend to miss a lot of time, right? And then the Raptors, well, Kawhi left,
Yeah,
so
he's gone. And the
yeah, so
Raptors are pretty much donezo.
right, so I mean, so that's kind of how it is at this point. But yeah, so I think going into this season, like we obviously now we have to expect big things out of Denver because again
Yeah.
they won the title, and for now I think they're gonna be kind of sitting on that perch as the best team in the West. Again, can they get knocked off? Sure, because again we've
Easily.
seen every defending champion the last 5 years get knocked off, but somebody's got to do it first. And, I'm curious to see if somebody can do that.
Yeah. It's going to be fun to watch, I think. But they've really set the standard for how you put a team together and how you win a dang championship because, I mean, almost every game was a team win.
Yeah, and I mean, yeah, because that's kind of the interesting thing, because a lot of the talk, going into the playoffs, and and this was kind of, I guess, the reasoning behind, Jokic with his MVPs before was that the supporting cast, was a little bit weaker, in
Sure.
comparison to maybe what some other superstars, have had with championship teams. But like, again, these guys are no slouches, right? Like Jamal
No.
Murray is really good.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, Aaron Gordon, right? What he can do,
Underrated.
especially defensively, yeah, underrated, especially on the defensive end. I mean, even offensively, right? Like he's been able to do some things, because he can play off of the other guys.
Yes.
When he was in Orlando, he was, kind of like a go-to guy, and that's kind of
He's
not
their
really what
number
he.
one option.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, like splitting time between the number one, number two option with him and Vucevic, and
Yeah.
it's kind of one of the perfect examples of slotting in a way, right? Kind of like what we saw with Wiggins when the
Right.
Warriors title a couple of seasons ago, where it's like, most guys aren't probably good enough to be the best or second best player on a team. But there are many guys where if you just slot them down to like, maybe that third, or
That
even
third or
fourth role,
fourth
like
option,
that,
then
yeah, all of a sudden, like, they
difference
all of a sudden look
makers.
really, really, really good, right? Because
Mhm.
Wiggins' stock was very low, when the Warriors first traded for him, right? He was traded for D'Angelo Russell,
Right.
so I mean, and that's no disrespect to D'Angelo Russell, right? But at the time, Wiggins' stock was so low because his contract was looked at as being really bad. Even though he was, a solid player, right? It just never felt like he lived up to, his hype and his
Yeah, as a
potential.
number
Even
one
though
pick, he wasn't
yeah,
he wasn't living up to it in
right.
Minnesota.
And even though I still don't necessarily think, he was as good as what you would have liked him to be, it's very clear he can certainly help a team win,
Oh
right?
yeah, absolutely.
Exactly, because again, the Warriors don't win the title without him, and similar to Denver, right? The Nuggets, they don't win the title without Aaron Gordon, because again, he's the guy that's going out there defending, like Kevin Durant or Towns or
Even
LeBron or
AD sometimes.
yeah, AD, Jimmy Butler, exactly right. He's the guy that's going out there defending all the tough assignments. So
Even
and
hit some threes too, wide
yeah,
open. So
right, and like I said, that's the thing with Denver is that they showed they can defend, and that was the question,
right.
with them, because we knew they could score, but the question, but they were kind of mediocre defensively during the regular season, but they elevated it during the playoffs. And again, this is why some of the regular season stuff doesn't necessarily matter quite as much because again, the last two months of the season they took off,
Right.
basically went on break, and right as the playoffs started, they turned it up, a notch, and then played some championship level basketball. So
Right.
I'm kind of curious, what they do. Like I said, the regular season this time around, just because they've already won the title, so they may not necessarily feel the need to like go as all out as they did early on. But I also just think that they're good enough that talent wise, they could just win a bunch of regular season games. Because like I said, as long as Jokic and a few solid guys are out there, they're going to be able to get some wins.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really excited for
Yeah,
Denver. Been a long time
yeah,
coming for
because
them.
yeah, and again, like with their strengths, part of the issue with them is that they're a very big team, but they're also a really skilled team.
Yeah.
Because it's one thing to be kind of like a big but slow and plodding team. Kind of like the older grit and grind Grizzlies sort of.
Right.
Uh, you know, or like there's also teams that are really small but also very skilled, like say Golden State. But again, Denver is very tough to manage because again they have the size of like those Grizzlies teams, kind of, but they have the skill of a team like say like a Golden State or something like I'm not comparing their players to Steph and
I get you.
all that, but you know what I mean. Like it's a
Yes.
highly skilled team. It's
Yeah.
not just like I said a slow plodding lumbering team, and that's tough to deal with because if you're going against that team and you're small, you're going to get fatigued eventually over the course of a 7-game series. And, if you're a
Exactly.
small team and you're fatigued, that's really tough to manage because a big part of beating bigger teams when you're small is the effort and the energy. And if you just don't have that, we saw it with Golden State and the Lakers, where eventually Golden State just kind of ran out of gas because the Lakers were too big for Golden State. And
Yeah.
then Denver was a little too big for LA. So,
And it's hard to replicate what Denver has because, like you said, these guys are huge, pause, but at the same time they're extremely skilled. So it's like you
yeah,
can't really replicate that because those guys only come around once in a while, or it may
right.
take those younger guys a little bit longer to get there.
Right. Because you
So
look at, again, you look at each guy at their relative to their positions, right? Jamal Murray is a big guard, for his
yeah,
position. He plays the point, but he's like, 6'4", 6'5",
right.
over 200. KCP is, kind of slight, but he's still 6'4", 6'5", which is, decent height for a two guard. Michael Porter Jr. 6'10", pretty good
Yeah,
athlete.
it's broken.
Gordon, yeah, Aaron Gordon 6'9" at the four, which is, in the modern NBA, that's pretty big for a power forward, and
Yes.
he's very athletic. And then Jokic is obviously huge. So I
Yep.
mean, again, like that's a really tough, thing to manage. And again, like I said, I still don't feel like we're, in that Golden State 2017, 2018 Durant
No, no,
era.
no,
And
no, no.
yeah, like it's definitely not that at all.
It's
But I
not a
do think
super team. It's a
not
great
at all.
team though.
It's a really good team, and
Yeah.
it's a very tough matchup for a lot of teams. Like I said, I feel like probably like a team, the type of team, that would probably be tough for them is a team that has like some guard that can play really well in the pick and roll. But even then, like,
I'm thinking like
still,
Milwaukee. Like I need to see Denver Milwaukee play against
yeah,
each other?
right. Yeah, and again,
I
like,
don't want to see Denver Miami. No disrespect to Miami, but they just weren't
right.
equipped and we know that. Like we
It's
said
just
with the size.
Yeah, for that, Middleton and Holiday, I think would need to be, kind of on their A game. And we'll talk about the Bucks, once we
Right.
get to that. But like they weren't as consistent in the playoffs on offense, so that's kind of the worry for them. But then you have Giannis, right? Who's even though he's very different from Jokic, he's equally like very tough to stop. I guess people saw how he played in the playoffs, against Miami, where he had stretches where he kind of just didn't really look good. And that's kind of the difference between him and Jokic, because Jokic has a better shot and all that other stuff.
Sure.
But again, it will be interesting to see, like, what type of which team actually, does, have a really good chance. Some people, say like maybe Golden State, but again, it's like, Golden State
I
would
don't
have,
agree.
yeah, it's just Denver, they don't have, Denver doesn't have like an AD in terms of like a guy that can break everything up defensively. But, like say Golden State in the playoffs, their issue mainly was at the end of games, they could not score. They could not,
Right.
figure out ways to really get effective offense because you mainly had, because they had to completely change how they had to play against the Lakers. Now you can say a big part of that is AD,
Oh,
for,
100%.
but I do just kind of, because again, like you got to guard Denver, and it's like, yeah, they got to guard you, but it seems like down the stretch they have, some type of way to find whatever type of shot they can get, right? Because
Yeah.
again, you got, Jokic, who's a high IQ basketball player, right? He's a guy, they have two guys that can basically create something out of literally nothing.
We
'Cause
saw
we
it,
saw,
one-legged threes,
yeah,
fading
exactly,
threes,
exactly,
buzzer
and that's
beaters. I
yeah,
mean, stuff
and when
that's
you
you
yeah,
can't replicate.
and when you have that plus, a solid defense, that's really tough to stop. Because it'd be one thing if it was like just completely one side of the ball, right?
Right.
But we saw that they have defensive chops, and
Both
again,
sides.
yeah, and that's what I'm saying. So like, I do think they are very well positioned to go back to back. I don't know if they will do it, but I think they have as good of a shot as any of the last few teams that would have had an opportunity to do so.
Yeah.
Because again, age wise, experience wise, and just talent wise, I think they can do it.
It's definitely in their favor.
Yeah. So, again, let us know what you think in the comments, of, what our take on Denver is. Do you agree or disagree? I think, like I said, I think we both think that they're, probably as of right now, the best team in the Western Conference until proven otherwise. Because again, they have the benefit of the doubt of they won the title last year and they cruised through, the Western Conference for the most part. So, again, until somebody takes them off that perch right now, they're kind of sitting atop there,
Right.
for now. So, let us know what you think.
Yes.
So now, we're gonna get into some news and rumors. We had a couple of things, that were a little small, so we'll start with those. We had a couple of free agency signings, right? I believe, Shvi Mikhailuk went to Boston, right? That was a guy, that used to be in LA, kind of bounced around after that, right? Basically just like a, wing shooter kind of. He can do some things with the ball, but hasn't really stuck around just because he's not really much of a defender, but he's gonna be in Boston. We'll see who wins out the battle between him and Sam Hauser, but we'll see.
Yeah, I was gonna say, do you think he's gonna provide much of an impact? Because I'm not really familiar with his game, but
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, because I mean, the Hauser guy can kind of, I think, do similar stuff. It's
I
just,
think he
I
can
think
shoot too.
Tyler can do more stuff with the ball,
Okay.
but also like he's not very good defensively, and
Right.
and I just, it doesn't. It seemed like for a while Boston didn't want those type of guys, but I do think they've kind of felt like we need more offense. We need to
Okay.
juice up our offense. But I don't know. I don't know how much he'll play.
Okay.
Because again, like, for a lot of these guys at this point in the season that are like 13th, 14th, 15th man signings, they're probably not going to play a whole lot,
Right.
unless guys are out. But,
Just need an
he's
extra
a
body
guy
for
who,
practice sometimes
yeah,
too.
well,
So
or he could just be a random guy that you could plug in, right? Because I
right.
don't think Sam
Exactly.
Hauser initially, would have been looked at as like an actual rotational guy. And then he started, playing a little bit more, I think, for Boston at different points.
Yeah.
Another one, according to Chris Haynes, the Kings signed JaVale McGee, right? So we had talked about, a little while ago. I can't remember when it was, but it was at least a couple weeks ago, I think, where
Yeah, I
it
think it
was,
was 1 or 2 weeks ago. Exactly.
yeah, where it was reported that Dallas was probably going to waive and stretch JaVale McGee, which made sense, right? Because that contract that they gave him never really made sense. He had a really good season for Phoenix this year before, but just because of his age, I just don't think a 3-year deal made any sense.
Right.
He just didn't pan out in Dallas, right? It just seemed like he's probably not a guy that you can really play like give a ton of minutes to. Um, you know, and again, given like the lack of bigs that Dallas had, that kind of also meant like you were either really relying on him or you just couldn't play him at all.
Right.
And like, when you're really relying on, a guy like that at this point in his career, that's just not really like a great sign, I think.
Sure, I
Um,
agree.
so whereas for Sacramento, because you already have, Sabonis as your center, you don't need as much from JaVale McGee, right? He could be a guy that you just randomly, kind of like what they did with Alex Len,
Alex
where we
Lynn,
just
yeah.
randomly saw him, for a few minutes in a game here or there, even in the playoffs, where now his role is going to be a little bit lessened. And I think at this point in his career makes sense. Plus, it's also again another veteran locker room guy who's won some titles. Again that can because this is a really young team as well. And unlike Denver, they haven't won yet. So, he's a guy that kind of showed them, some things
Yeah.
in the locker room, I
Just
think.
like
So,
DeAndre Jordan. That's a good move, I think. That's
yeah,
something
like there's not,
Sacramento actually needed.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, because we talked about they didn't really have much in terms of rim protection. And again, like I said, I don't know, how impactful he can be at this point. But again, for presumably a minimum signing for a guy who's not going to play like a ton, where you're not relying on him, like I don't have an issue with
Yeah.
that.
I like it. Good
Yeah.
for him.
Um, and then we have, according to the Athletic, um, we kind of talked about this like a tiny bit. This was, I think, way back around the trade deadline.
Oh joy.
But we kind of glossed over it because it just didn't really feel like a thing that made a whole lot of sense. I think it was talked about in the off season, early in the off season as well. I think maybe remember, but about the Lakers still eyeing Trae Young. Basically, like if the Atlanta situation kind of just blows up, it's like, yeah, I guess they'd be really interested in him. Um, it is kind of interesting, right? Because we had sort of heard a thing, later in the playoffs, or I think, or something like that, that suggested not a lot of teams really wanted him. And I do think part of that may just be because he's so small, not really, existent on the defensive end,
Right.
doesn't really play off the ball.
But doesn't have the same offensive impact as Curry.
Yeah, exactly. So it's just like, that again, and he does some really good things. Like I think he's
Great
a
player.
really good player. Like, yeah, he's
Underrated at this point.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Like terrific around the basket, really good passer, clearly a fearless guy, right? That doesn't play scared, which you like to have.
Yeah.
Um and again, like if you're LA, like I guess if there's a quote unquote a path to do it, like I don't have a problem with it. I
But
just
what
don't.
would you give up though?
Yeah, because that's the issue. Because it's like again, if you're Atlanta, right? That's like what is that? Like something like D'Angelo Russell,
Right?
um, I guess like a Rui, and
Yeah.
then maybe like one or two of their random young guys or something. But
And
then
then
it's
a
like,
first rounder at least.
yeah, and then a first, yeah, exactly. Forgot to mention the picks, but it's like I don't know. I mean, like if you're Atlanta, I mean, I
It's not
guess
worth it though.
yeah, like because again, that's the thing is like just because a situation might call for a guy being traded, it doesn't automatically mean that's what you should do.
Right.
Atlanta is in a rough spot because they gave up picks,
Yeah.
to get DeJounte Murray, and it's not even that DeJounte Murray's been bad; it's just the team hasn't been good enough,
Right.
to where it's like you don't feel good about giving up those picks right now.
Right.
We'll see what Atlanta does, obviously, but they're kind of in a stretch right now where they almost kind of have to, at least for now, kind of like see if it works. Because again, like let's say they traded Trae Young, like at the deadline or something. Well, they still don't have picks for a couple seasons, I think, or something like
Yeah.
that. So you don't want to do that right now because then, like, you're just gifting San Antonio,
Yeah, it's
great
not
draft
smart.
capital. So maybe it could happen down the line because we talked about it with our Lakers episode, where I do think like, that D'Angelo Russell contract is like kind of prime trade bait.
It's movable,
Um,
all right.
yeah, exactly. Like I don't know if like you can use that to get a Trae Young or something like that,
Somebody
obviously, but
around D'Lo's tier or a little bit better, but
yeah,
not all star. I don't think. But
yeah,
I
because
could be
that
completely wrong.
yeah, you never know because again, what we think in terms of the value of players, maybe clearly a lot of times they're different than what than what the GMs around the league
Oh
think.
yeah, for sure.
Because at one point we were kind of skeptical about the fact, as to whether or not Westbrook would have gotten moved, and then he got moved, and they
We
got a
weren't even
decent.
sure if that was gonna work.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So, I don't know. It's an interesting rumor, and again, his name has come up multiple times, and it's really been like the only team I can think of that really has like, you know, where like they're in Trey Young rumors, because like I haven't heard any other teams where it's like, oh, they're interested in Trey Young. It's mainly just been L.A.
Right.
And again, it could also just be like, because LeBron, is obviously going to be nearing the end of his career at some point, you'd like to see, while, especially since you gave AD that extension, can you get a co star, alongside AD, or maybe you could potentially still snag, one of those quote unquote third stars and try to help LeBron get, like title number 5 or something before he hangs it up. But, I don't know. It's an interesting rumor. I just feel like there's no traction right now, obviously, because I just think, everybody's got to wait and see what they
Yeah.
have right now, because everybody's pretty optimistic, I think, going into the season. And then once teams find out what they actually are, maybe we'll see some differences, right? Like if Atlanta has another, mediocre, or rough season, right? Maybe you might start hearing stuff about Trey Young, but for now, I don't think there's any real, things to it. Although, like I said, it is interesting that, like, I think the Lakers are the only team that I'm aware of that has really talked about, like, not officially talked about, but it seems like they're the only team that's really been tied to him for the most part.
Yeah. It's
And like,
interesting to me.
yeah, and like fit wise, yeah, it makes sense, right? Because again, a pick and roll guard that can play alongside Trey Young. If LeBron is still there, obviously that's a guy that can control some offense so that LeBron doesn't have to. It's just you got to be concerned about the size and the defense.
Yeah.
You know, that's that's the main concern. But like you said, I do think Trey Young, I think, is a little better than people are starting to give him credit for. Because
Oh
like you
yeah.
said, I think he's kind of. I don't want to. Yeah, because I think he's almost kind of getting into that like overhated, territory.
Yeah.
Um,
Beefing with
because
all of New York.
yeah, because like at one point he was. Some people thought he was in the overrated territory, and now I think he's in the underrated territory, or if not
Extremely underrated
underrated, like really close to that. But again, like I understand why some people might be turned off, just because again, like the last couple of seasons haven't gone great,
and the
and it
lack of
doesn't feel like
defense.
yeah, and it doesn't feel like he's progressed, in some of the areas that you would like him to. But the things
Right.
that he is best at, he is very good at.
Yes.
So
The
yeah,
playmaking
there
in
are
that floater game,
yeah,
scoop layups.
yeah, yeah,
It's
the things
insane.
that he is best at, there are very few guys that can do those type of things. So,
Exactly.
and I do think in the right situation, he could help a team. Maybe he can't be like a number one, but if he's like a number two or something like that, I think you could do some damage. I think.
Yeah.
Um, and then for our last thing, didn't really think that this conversation or topic would come up again, but so we had, obviously that referee situation,
Oh, I
with
forgot.
With Boston and LA.
Yeah.
So we had that, and obviously at the time, it was kind of a funny thing where, we kind of made jokes, and whatnot. And then we had that weird thing late into the season, or I guess I can't remember if it was late in the season or like early off season, where it was reported that, they had like done an investigation because he had a burner account. That referee had a
Right.
burner account, and I guess he was defending some of the calls he made,
Right.
in different situations or whatever. But that guy, so the NBA is like, yeah, he's retired. He's retired, effective immediately. Um, so yeah, that's. I'm not gonna lie, I did not expect to see a story like this at all.
Me
It was
neither.
kind of weird how, yeah, it was kind of weird how there was like no real context to it whatsoever. It was
Right.
just like, nope, it's retiring, nothing to see here. But
And like
man,
when you sent me that, I was like, so that basically means it's real because they were very vague about it. They weren't. There wasn't like
right,
a farewell tour. I mean, obviously a ref's not really gonna get a farewell tour, but you know what I mean. Like there's no appreciation or anything.
yeah,
So that tells me they quietly handled it behind the scenes and were like, we probably can't deal with this negative PR, so just retire. Simple
yeah,
as that.
yeah. I mean,
I was
because they
like, so
didn't,
this
because
means it's real.
yeah, because they hadn't really announced anything, since then. So like they hadn't even actually announced whether or
Forgot
not it
about
was
it.
that it was his. But just given that, you almost kind of feel like you got to connect some dots, here and then different points. It's
Yeah,
just so strange. Because again, like
it's the weirdest thing I've ever
yeah,
seen.
because again, like yeah, it was a bad missed no call. Um,
It
and I
was
still
really
remember.
bad.
Yeah, and I still remember, like, and obviously, you had the LeBron meme, and then you had, like, after the game, the weird thing from, like, the NBA refs Twitter page where it was like, we're going to have a lot of sleepless nights, thinking about how we missed that call.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, this is
Like,
really weird.
I don't know. And then Pat Bev with the camera.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, yeah, that was a pretty silly moment, I think, in NBA lore. Um, and it just keeps getting better because again, like just the fact that again, like he's retiring, and again, like there's no real information or a whole lot about it, but they just kind of put that out there. I'm surprised it wasn't like a Friday news dump or anything because we got
Right.
this, I believe it was Wednesday. But yeah, so that happened. So Eric Lewis is no longer an NBA rep. He's retiring.
I'm
And
sure he had a great career, but
yeah,
good
and
lord,
yeah,
this is
his signature.
nonsense.
Yeah, so but he's got a signature moment, because like every ref has some type of signature moment.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And he's got one, now. So,
Wow.
congratulations, on your early retirement. So
Yeah.
hopefully that goes well. Um, but we'll see.
We wish
It's
him
just
all the best, but good God, I don't know what was going through his mind.
because that is the interesting thing where it's like like and again, obviously, I'm not going to say a whole lot about that other stuff, but it's
Right.
just it always is kind of that's kind of like why the conversations about like sports betting with like the players or people involved or whatever is always kind of interesting conversation because it's like they don't want to necessarily make it feel like that the integrity of the game is compromised or anything
Right.
because we've seen like players at the end of games make motions to the refs like I think Luca did like the money
Yes.
paid off type of
Yes.
or whatever, and then he got tossed or whatever,
Right.
or got teed up or whatever. I think
Hmm.
Scotty Barnes, even though we couldn't see what he said because we didn't really know, but I think that he got tossed from a game because they said he questioned the integrity or something like that. But it's just stuff like this isn't necessarily a great look. That's
It's
all.
bad PR, and that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I think they handled this thing quietly and swiftly behind the scenes, and we're like, yeah, just retire.
It's just funny because by handling it in that matter or in that
It's
manner,
blown up even
everybody's
more.
talking about. So everybody's
Exactly.
talking about. It. So
They should have just shut up and not said anything. I'm kidding. You can't do that. They had to put out a statement because they
yeah,
can't just like not have
yeah.
the guy. That's like going to human resources in SpongeBob and never coming out. Like that's not how it works.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he's not gonna get shadow fired,
Yeah,
but
like, no.
but yeah, but and again, but and at least it wasn't like a Dylan Brooks situation where they're
Right,
like, under no circumstances will this guy
right,
ever
right.
be an NBA rep ever. They just sent him on an early retirement. So
Exactly. Paid for and all
congrats.
that.
Yeah, because how old is he? I
I'm
mean,
not
I don't.
sure.
Yeah, I don't think he's that old. I guess let me check. He's 52. Okay, so
Okay.
he's a little older than I thought. But
That's
refs can
still
have long.
younger though,
That's
like
still
for a
relatively
ref.
young. Yeah, because refs can have long careers. So I mean,
Mhm.
I think he did it for 19 seasons. Okay, so he's been a ref
Oh,
for about
wow.
20 years.
It's been
So
around though. Hmm.
yeah, so I guess that's yeah. So I don't know if I would say early retirement, but I guess
Let's
it
just
kind of
call it
is.
retirement.
Yeah. So congratulations.
Wow. Wish it
Um.
was under different circumstances, but
Yeah.
hey.
So yeah. Well, that's it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. I mean, again, let us know in the comments what you thought of our views on Denver. In terms of their team, what we thought of their offseason, and where we think they're going to go. Um, obviously, we've also noticed that everybody's been checking out, our previous videos. Again, our interview with NBA player KJ McDaniels, that's still up. So, if you're interested in that, please check it out. Other things like the summer league stuff. I know it's been a while since that
Yeah.
point. And also like again, our previous videos, on these other teams because we're covering all 30 teams. As the offseason is going on, we'll still obviously talk about news and rumors if those things come up.
Yep.
But regardless, we appreciate all the support. So hopefully you have a great weekend, and we'll see you Monday.